Imagine standing in the pre-dawn darkness of northern Gaul in the year 54 BC, watching a settlement that has existed for 300 years prepare for its final morning. The mist rises from the river like the breath of ghosts, and in that mist, you can just barely make out the silhouettes of Roman siege towers rolling into position. But the legions advancing through that fog aren't just coming for gold or territory. They're coming for something far more valuable and far more terrible. They're coming for the women who represent the very soul of this civilization. And what they plan to do to them has been deliberately erased from nearly every history book you've ever read. The Romans didn't just conquer territory, they conquered identity itself, and they did it through a system so sophisticated and so brutal that modern historians still struggle to fully document it. When Julius Caesar wrote his famous commentaries on the Gallic Wars, he filled page after page with details about military tactics, engineering marvels, and political maneuvering, but he left out the most important part of the story. He never wrote about what happened after the battles ended, when the screaming stopped and the real horror began. He never described the protocols his officers followed when they identified the wives of tribal chiefs, the queens and princesses who held sacred authority in their communities. He never explained the classification system that sorted captured women like livestock, assigning them value based on their beauty, their lineage, and their potential usefulness as tools of psychological warfare. This wasn't the chaos of undisciplined soldiers running wild after victory. This was policy. This was procedure. This was a machine designed to break entire peoples by destroying the women who embodied their sovereignty and their sacred traditions. And that machine operated with ruthless efficiency across every territory Rome conquered, leaving behind a trail of trauma that echoes through the centuries even though the specific stories have been buried beneath layers of sanitized historical narrative. The process began long before the attack itself. Roman scouts would spend weeks observing their targets, and they weren't just mapping defensive positions or counting warriors. They were cataloging the women of high status, identifying which ones were married to chiefs, which ones held religious authority, which ones commanded respect and loyalty from their people. These women weren't just potential prisoners. They were strategic assets whose capture could demoralize a population more effectively than burning every building or killing every warrior. The Romans understood something that modern military strategists would take centuries to fully appreciate, that destroying symbols is more powerful than destroying soldiers. When the assault finally came, it followed patterns that had been refined through decades of conquest. The legions would strike before dawn, surrounding the settlement to cut off escape routes, then unleashing a coordinated attack designed to create maximum chaos. But hidden within that chaos was a surgical operation. Specialized teams of soldiers moved through the burning settlement with specific assignments, searching for designated targets. They had orders to capture certain women alive, to drag them from their homes while their husbands and sons died defending ground that was already lost. If you're finding value in these forgotten stories of history's darkest chapters, consider subscribing to support this channel. These are the narratives that don't make it into mainstream documentaries, the human experiences that get lost when we focus only on dates and battles and famous names. Your subscription helps ensure that these voices aren't silenced forever, that the suffering and the resistance and the complicated truth of what really happened doesn't disappear into comfortable myths about glory and civilization. And please, leave a comment sharing what strikes you most about these stories, because understanding how power operated in the past helps us recognize how it operates today. The sorting process that followed capture was where the true calculation became visible. Roman officers would examine each prisoner with the cold assessment of merchants evaluating merchandise. Common women were valued for labor and sold in bulk. Skilled women commanded higher prices based on their abilities. Noble women were kept for specialized purposes or given as gifts to important citizens. But the queens and princesses, the wives of kings and high chiefs, they faced something different entirely. They were placed into a category designed not just to exploit them individually but to send a message to every conquered people about the absolute powerlessness of their former rulers. These women were stripped of every symbol of their status, given Roman names that erased their identities, and forced to perform public acts of submission. But the psychological warfare went deeper than humiliation. They were interrogated using methods that combined threats, isolation, and calculated cruelty to extract information about hidden treasures, resistance networks, and sacred knowledge. The Romans understood that a broken queen could be more valuable than 1,000 informants, because her cooperation represented the surrender of everything her people held sacred. And some of these women, faced with impossible circumstances, learned to turn that system against itself in ways their captors never anticipated. Caratica was the wife of Amborix, king of the Eburones, and when the Roman legions overran her settlement in the brutal winter of 54 BC, they thought they had captured a trophy to display their dominance. What they had actually captured was something far more dangerous, a woman who had spent her entire life preparing for exactly this moment, who understood that intelligence could be a more devastating weapon than any sword, and who was willing to spend years pretending to be broken while she systematically destroyed the Roman command structure from within. She had advantages the Romans never recognized because they couldn't imagine them. She spoke fluent Latin, understood military organization, and had traveled extensively between tribal courts as part of diplomatic missions. When she was brought before Marcus Crassus, the young ambitious commander eager to prove himself worthy of his famous family name, she didn't beg or threaten or remain defiantly silent like most captives. She negotiated. She offered to trade information for better treatment, and Crassus, seeing an opportunity to extract valuable intelligence, gave her access that would prove catastrophic. For 3 months, Karatika played her role with perfect precision. She provided information about hidden weapon caches that didn't exist, revealed locations of tribal meetings that had been abandoned, named resistance leaders who were already dead or beyond Roman reach. Every piece of intelligence was carefully crafted to seem valuable while actually being worthless, designed to waste Roman time and resources while she learned everything about their operational procedures. She memorized patrol schedules, identified officers who could be bribed, mapped communication networks. She attended planning meetings as a translator, studied military maps, absorbed strategic discussions. The Romans believed they had turned a valuable asset. What they had actually done was give a brilliant strategist complete access to their vulnerabilities. The Phantom Rebellion began when Karatika identified the weak point in Roman efficiency. Their communication network relied on local messengers carrying written orders between camps. She began feeding false intelligence into that network, fabricated reports of planned ambushes and uprising plots that seemed credible because they came from a source Roman commanders trusted completely. Over months, she created a cascade of imaginary threats that triggered unnecessary troop movements, defensive preparations against dangers that didn't exist, and a growing atmosphere of paranoia that made every shadow seem like an enemy. But her masterpiece was recognizing that Roman military culture itself could be weaponized. She observed the rivalries between ambitious officers and began feeding each one information that suggested the others were plotting against them. She arranged for crude forgeries to be discovered that implied treachery in the command structure. She watched as suspicion and paranoia spread like disease through the Roman leadership, as officers stopped trusting each other, as information flow broke down, as the efficient machine began grinding against itself. Meanwhile, through a network of sympathizers, she was passing real intelligence to her husband Ambiorix and his warriors still operating in the forests. The contrast was devastating. Roman forces chased phantom threats while actual resistance fighters used accuracy information to launch precision raids against vulnerable targets. Supply convoys disappeared, isolated outposts fell, and when Crassus consulted with Karatika about these mysterious attacks, she expressed concern, suggested explanations, recommended defensive measures that actually made Roman positions more vulnerable to the raids she was helping to coordinate. By the spring of 52 BC, Karatika had convinced Crassus that a massive tribal alliance was forming to launch a coordinated offensive. The intelligence was detailed and terrifying, and Crassus, desperate to avoid being caught unprepared, concentrated his forces in defensive positions that left vast territories undefended. Roman commanders became more afraid of each other than of the Gallic resistance. Caesar himself was forced to intervene in a region that should have been pacified but was instead in chaos. The investigation that followed Karatika's eventual exposure revealed the full scope of what she had accomplished. She had turned Roman competence into their greatest weakness, used their efficiency against them, and proven that the women they had classified and sorted and discarded as conquered property could be more dangerous than any army they had ever faced. The Romans had built a machine designed to break the spirit of entire peoples through the systematic exploitation of their women. But they had forgotten that broken things can have sharp edges, and that some women would spend years learning exactly where to cut. Her story was deliberately buried in a historical record, reduced to a footnote if mentioned at all, because it represented something the Romans couldn't acknowledge: that their system of conquest had fatal vulnerabilities, that the women they had catalogued and processed and discarded as defeated could be planning revenge with every breath, and that intelligence and patience could sometimes accomplish what armies could not. What happened to the wives of defeated chiefs was worse than history admits, not just because of the systematic brutality they endured, but because we have chosen to forget their resistance, their intelligence, and their refusal to accept the fate their conquerors designed for them. We remember the battles and the treaties and the famous names, but we've lost the stories of the women who fought back, using the only weapons available to them: their minds, their patience, and their absolute unwillingness to be erased. Leave a comment below and tell me, do you think Karatika's story represents justice or simply another tragedy in an endless cycle of violence? Do we celebrate her for fighting back, or mourn that she was forced into circumstances where such devastating tactics were her only option? These are questions without easy answers, but they are questions we need to keep asking if we want to understand not just what happened in history, but what it meant for the people who lived through it.